Hello and welcome. We're going to talk for a short time, or I'm going to talk, and hopefully encourage some discussion among those of you who view this about the book of Job. Job is an extremely complicated book, both structurally, textually, on the linguistic level, and in its content. Jews seem to have, in our tradition, a rather ambivalent relationship to Job. Unlike other texts in Tuvim, it's not assigned reading for any particular occasion in the year. Nor do we name our children after its hero, Eov. Those of you who are familiar with the story, that would seem to be an obvious thing. However, in the Arabic-speaking world, Christians and Muslims alike name boys Ayub. As a matter of fact, Salah ad-Din, who we know in English as Saladin, from Kurdistan, his dynastic name was Ayubi. And he's called in English, his dynasty is the Ayyubids, the Ayyubid dynasty. But we seem to have a bit of a hands-off relationship to the book. It's not ritualized, it's not highly quoted. It is quoted and it is discussed, but it doesn't occupy the place in rabbinic literature of, say, Shir HaShirim. But it's deeply challenging. And I'm going to try and propose that dafka, in the situation that we find ourselves in today in the world, facing a massive pandemic, that Eov can be of particular use to us, but perhaps not in an unexpected way. I'm assuming a significant amount of knowledge here on your part, that you've looked at the book, that you know what it's about. There's a frame narrative about a challenge between God's chief prosecutor, Hasatan, which literally means the adversary. He is, of course, not the adversary of God, as in Christian traditions. Rather, he is the adversary of humanity. He's God's DA. Many people read Hasatan as sort of the anthropomorphic figure of Midat Hadin, the aspect of God's judgment that together with mercy adds up to justice. He challenges God about human faith. God gestures to Job, says, look how wonderful and righteous he is. And Hasatan sort of scoffs because Job is a wealthy man. He's very successful, very rich, very happy. It's very easy to have faith when you do right and everything goes right for you. However, God lets Hasatan do a little experiment, and he goes down, kills his children, wipes out his possessions in one fell swoop. And Job does not renounce God. Hasatan goes back up, and God says, so, what did you see? And Hasatan says, well, yeah, but you didn't do anything to him, not on his own skin. So God authorizes Hasatan to afflict Eov. After which, Eov sits down and basically sits Shiva. His wife tells him to blaspheme God, curse God, and die. And he sits there, and we see what looks like a Shiva. 3 friends come to visit, and they don't address him. And this is important because they don't address him until he speaks. They sit there for days until he speaks. And this is exactly our custom when we go to a Shiva. Our custom is not to address the mourners until they address us. You're supposed to just go in and sit down and be with them unless they want to talk to you. At which point, Eov starts the poetic part of the book, which goes on for 40-odd chapters. And he laments the day he was created and attests to his innocence. And this is critical because nowhere does the book call into question Job's innocence. It's affirmed throughout. It's not just his contention. This is a man who has done nothing wrong and has suffered horribly. What transpires is often then read as a philosophical symposium on the problem of tzaddik veralo, a righteous person who suffers. His friends answer his lament. He answers them. They come back and forth. A fourth one shows up. And then finally, there's a dialogue with God who shows up in a whirlwind. Now, I'm going to set aside the textual problems here because, in fact, these figures of Job's friends and Job himself, they somewhat contradict each other, and some textual scholars, based on linguistic evidence and also looking for a more coherent read of the book, have suggested all kinds of ways to pull it apart and put it back together, to assign certain lines to other figures and to move things around a little bit so that it really works like a coherent philosophical dialogue in which people generally don't contradict one another unless they mark that they're changing their mind, which is not the case here. And this really raises a question of genre. Should we be reading it like a philosophical symposium? I am going to look at the problems that the book addresses in brief, and then teach a reading of the text that suggests that we may be reading it wrong in the sense of what its true genre is and what the character of Yov really seeks, and especially what it teaches us about how we confront suffering that is incomprehensible to us. So the first issue that's raised in the book is that human suffering is not necessarily deserved. It seems obvious to us. Indeed, Eob's friends often raise to him, you must have done something wrong. Maybe you just didn't know it. Maybe your kids did something wrong, and that's why they suffered. But just because you don't know it, God is good, and therefore you must have done something wrong. And Eov attests that he's innocent, he insists, and he never gives this point up. Now, it's a particular problem for us as Jews that this idea that human suffering is not deserved. Because if you ask any Jew with minimal education, what is the central statement of our faith, I think they'll say the Shema. Now, this idea that suffering is undeserved potentially contradicts what we recite twice a day in the Shema as our most important expression of our faith. Now, in the ancient world, the greatest civilization was Egypt, and it had a big river. And that meant water was always available and could be diverted for human needs, for irrigation, for agriculture. And it's no mistake that when we come to Pesach, the story of Pesach, that the first plagues attack the river, the Nile. It's the center of life. Now, there was another ecology in this area of the ancient world, and that was the desert ecology. And in desert ecology, human communities grew up around wells or oases, or people traveled between them. And we see this in the patriarchal narratives of the Avot. But what the Shema tells us is that it's preparing us for the land of Israel, where the ecology is dependent upon rainfall. And what it ultimately says, if you look in the second paragraph, is it presents us with a threefold if. If you keep the mitzvot, rain will fall, things will grow, everything will be wonderful. If you do not keep the mitzvot, rain will not fall, and you'll be in trouble, and you'll suffer. However, if you repent, rain will fall again. Now, that means that if things are going bad, somebody must have messed up with the commandments. But there's also a problem with the theology of that. First of all, we know that people keep commandments, both ethical and ritual, and yet suffer terribly. And we can also see people who are very far from virtuous who prosper, and often not just in spite of their lack of virtue, but sometimes because of it. But Job addresses in establishing that there is suffering that is not deserved, that is not earned, the theological problem of a God who can be fully instrumentalized. If you look at that paragraph in the Shema, it gives us an enormous amount of power. And we want human agency. We want to have control over our societies, over our destinies. We want our actions to be meaningful and to have both practical and moral efficacy of some sort. On the other hand, why would a creator God of infinite power, which entails infinite knowledge and wisdom, assume an entirely reactive position in which the Torah becomes little more than an instruction manual, and God is reduced to a mechanism primed for our manipulation? I personally want a God who is responsive in some sense, but not purely reactive. A God who is a source of wisdom and blessing, and not merely the enforcing power of a covenantal relationship. Furthermore, the problem with the idea that suffering is deserved, which Job comes to refute, is that it leads to aspersions, either against sufferers or God, and often both. If suffering is deserved, then every time we see it, we will automatically or reflexively impugn the sufferer as guilty, as Job's friends do. You must have done something wrong. The monstrosities of this view are clear. A child suffering from a terminal illness is not guilty in our tradition. The Rambam even argues that the scriptural pronouncement to Moshe on Sinai that God punishes our children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren for our sins pertains only to the sin of idolatry. He limits it to the sin of idolatry. And he says that this is because most humans know only parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents. Very few of us know great-great-grandparents. It is these who influence us. The sin of idolatry robs us of the necessary first premise for understanding the world, which is that it is the creation of a single, unified, supreme deity. So if we are idolaters, the generations that we produce and interact with will be punished by being robbed, in essence by us, of the necessary basis for a moral and comprehensible life. They will sin as a consequence of us, and as such incur punishment. More than this, the sin of idolatry is in some senses, according to the Rambam, its own punishment. And this is the only way, according to the Rambam, in which God punishes our posterity to the third and fourth generations. The bigger problem is that if we admit that suffering is not always deserved, unlike Job's interlocutors, then we face the problem of aspersions cast on God, that God is no less capricious and unpredictable and frequently cruel as the deities we see in many polytheisms. And so we confront the problem of theodicy, the need to defend God from accusations of evil, from responsibility for innocent suffering. Theodicy is a significant tradition in Western religious thought. One of the best explications of its challenge I have read is in the work of Dennis Danielson, a scholar of John Milton, whose Paradise Lost participate significantly in this tradition, with its stated aim to justify the ways of God to men. Danielson states 3 propositions, any 2 of which work together without contradiction, until one introduces the third. The first proposition is that God is omnipotent, all-powerful, that includes all-knowing. The second is that God is omnibeneficent, wholly good. And the third is that there is evil and suffering in the world. It would be easy to accept that God is both all-powerful and all-good if there were no evil and suffering in the world. An all-powerful God, an all-good God, no suffering, works fine. It would be easy to accept that God is all-powerful and there is suffering if we don't believe that God is all-good. It would be easy to accept that God is wholly good and there is evil and suffering in the world if we don't commit to the idea of God's incomparable and infinite power. Any 2 of these work together until we introduce the third. The quasi-conclusion put forth at the end of Job, or one might call it an aporetic conclusion, is that ultimately suffering is beyond human understanding, or at least we are not in a position to understand all suffering. Many, if not most readers, find this to be ultimately unsatisfying. One problem it leaves us with is that it seems to support an anti-intellectual position, or at least one of intellectual quietism. And this robs us of agency, the agency that the Shema gives us. It suggests that the proper religious subjectivity is to simply obey without trying to understand. But our part in the covenant at Sinai, which we accept upon ourselves, is that we will do and we will hear. Na'aseh v'nishma. And hearing here connotes understanding. Our tradition, in all its authorities, elevates the study of Torah among its highest ethics and values. This position of intellectual quietism reduces Torah study, or would reduce Torah study, to rote memorization and clarification of practice. It does not suggest a subjectivity in which we ought to strive to understand the world and its creator for the sake of wisdom as a fundamental human practice and value. Here I'd like to introduce what I think is one of the most compelling readings of Job, and one that suggests that the book can be of particular use to us in these trying times, not from a biblical scholar or a rabbinic source, but from a man named Amos Funkenstein, a fascinating theorist of Jewish historiography, that is, of the way that Jews understand and articulate history, who died of cancer in 1995 at age 58, a great loss for the Jewish academic and intellectual world. He was a polymath, a Renaissance man. He was revered as a teacher. He was politically engaged, knew all the languages that somebody who wants to be a master of the Western tradition would need to. He was born and raised in an observant home, an observant Jewish home, left traditional observance, but not his engagement with Jewish intellectual history and its traditional sources. In his book, Perceptions of Jewish History, he lays out a highly idiosyncratic reading of Job that distances it from Theodicy. In fact, he argues for reading Job's question regarding how it is possible for a righteous person to suffer evil in a world ostensibly governed by an omnipotent and omnibeneficent God, instead as a desire, as a performative speech act. In short, Funkenstein reads Job not necessarily as trying to solve the problem of tzaddik veralo, the righteous one who suffers, but as articulating a desire of demanding a hearing. Job demands his day in court. He knows he's unlikely to prevail. After dispensing with the abstract reasoning of all his friends who come to comfort him, he doesn't so much refute them as he responds with concrete personal testimony about his experience. He doesn't so much refute them, and even at times agrees with them, but reveals that their arguments are inappropriate to the occasion. One does not turn a Shiva call into a platform for one's philosophical speculations or into a symposium in which one debates the bereaved. At the opening of chapter 9, in an oft-quoted passage within a highly poetic text, Job responds to his friend Bildad flatly, "I know it is so, but how should a man be just before God?" Job never questions the immeasurable distance between himself and God, but affirms it. He soon after that says, "For he is not a man as I am, that I should answer him, and we should come together in judgment." Yet this is precisely what he seeks. In chapter 23, he laments, "Oh, that I knew where I might find him, that I might come even to his seat. I would arrange my case before him and fill my mouth with arguments." Job doesn't want a philosophical symposium or seminar. He wants the opportunity to plead his case before God. And indeed, at the end of the book, as the dispute shifts from Job and his friends to Job and God, God first chastises Job's friends, despite upholding much of their arguments, for not speaking nechona, correctly, as Job had. God's answer to Job does not satisfy the philosophical question of theodicy, and it's not going to satisfy ours, but it does satisfy Job's need to be heard, to stand before the creator of the universe, as Abraham does before the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, challenging him to be just and seeking an understanding of his justice. More importantly, God licenses Job's mode of complaint, just as he accepts challenges from Abraham and from Moshe after the golden calf. He sees Job's speech as correct. There's an odd pedagogical payoff here, considering the source of this reading. The author who left traditional religion behind. Job gets his hearing and receives an answer. He accepts a priori, in advance, that this answer may be beyond him, may not satisfy him. But the text is telling us that when we are completely at a loss in the face of grave suffering, our own or that of others, as we have so often faced so many times in our history, we should come and stand before the author of the cosmos and the God of history, for he's one and the same, and we should bring our complaints. Demand your answer, even perhaps accuse, but come. It is correct to do so. We aren't supposed to simply shrug at God's mysterious ways and accept quietly. Accept, but not necessarily quietly. One of the terms in rabbinic literature for the shaliach tzibur, the leader of public prayer, is a karev. This can be translated as one who draws the congregation near, karov, but it also has the sense of krav, of battle, the one who does battle on behalf of an aggrieved people with God, who fights their case out in court. There is a way in which, in trying times, we are invited to come and stand before our God and do battle with him. This doesn't solve all the lacunae in Job. It certainly doesn't solve the question of theodicy, but I do think that it lends the book a certain utility for us, and particularly at this moment. I want to end with a story I heard. It was told to me orally in the name of the Hasidic rabbi, Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev. And I think it ties in nicely to what is happening here. The day after Yom Kippur, Levi Yitzchak was walking through Berdichev, and he sees one of his chassidim. And he realizes that he didn't see him the day before on Yom Kippur in Shul. So he naturally assumed that the man had been ill, and he went to inquire after his health. The man looked at him and said, "Rebbe, I'm fine." You're fine? So well, why weren't you in shul yesterday? And the man says, oh, look, Rebbe, I'm far from perfect. Some mornings I eat before davening shachris. I yell at my kids and my wife. I'm late with debts. I don't always fulfill my promises. When I'm on the road for business, traveling for business, I'm not always so careful about where I eat. I don't claim to be perfect, but him. Parents from children, children from parents, wars, famines, floods, plagues. And I am supposed to ask forgiveness of him? Levi Yitzchak put his face in his hands and began to weep. And his chassid tries to comfort him and says, Rebbe, it's okay, don't worry. I'll come to shul this Shabbos, you'll see me, I'll be there next Yom Kippur. He's like, it's not that. He looks at the man and he says, who knows? But with that argument, you might have redeemed all of Israel. We never know what answer we're going to get. But the message, at least in Amos Funkenstein's reading of Iyov, is you may never understand, but come, show up, complain, accuse, cry, fight, argue, demand a hearing. If your case is just, bring it to God. And I think that can be of enormous comfort when we face major loss. We won't always get the answer we want, but we might. Thank you for listening.